There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a man when he's been told, without anyone actually saying the words, that he doesn't belong in the room he helped build. I sat with that quiet for the better part of a year. I want to tell you that I saw the ending coming, that I had some plan running in the background the whole time. I didn't. I just kept doing what I'd always done, showing up, saying little, and letting the truth take its own time to arrive. It arrived on a Saturday in October, in the gravel lot behind a restaurant in Minneapolis, in the low rumble of about 40 engines that nobody inside that building had been expecting. My name is Hal Brennan. Everyone who's ever mattered to me calls me Hal. I'm 68 years old, a retired command sergeant major, 26 years in the United States Army, and for the last 4 of those years I have also, apparently, been an embarrassment to my son-in-law's dinner table. I didn't know that part until he said it out loud, in front of my granddaughter, over a plate of turkey that cost more than my first car payment. This isn't a story about revenge. I don't have any taste for that, and by the end you'll understand why. It's a story about what happens when you underestimate a quiet man, and what happens when the people you dismiss turn out to be the very ground you're standing on. Before I tell you about that Saturday, I need to take you back about 14 months, to a much smaller kitchen, and a dog named Rosie who still thought I hung the moon. Back then I was living alone in a 2-bedroom rambler on the west side of Duluth, Minnesota, 3 blocks up from Lake Superior, close enough that on windy nights I could hear the water working against the break wall like something breathing. My wife, Carol, had passed 6 years before that from ovarian cancer, and the house had never quite filled back in around the space she left. I kept busy. I had to. Most mornings started the same way. Up at 5:30, coffee black, a walk down to the point with Rosie, my black Labrador, who had exactly 2 moods, thrilled and asleep. 3 days a week I volunteered at the VFW post on Piedmont Avenue, mostly helping newer veterans wade through disability paperwork, because the paperwork is its own war and nobody warns you about that part. The other days I spent in my garage, restoring old tube radios. It started as a way to keep my hands busy after Carol died and turned into something like a second vocation. I had a 1947 Zenith Transoceanic on the bench that fall, patient as a hell breath, waiting for me to source the right capacitors. I didn't need anybody to know what I used to be. That was the whole point of the life I'd built. In the Army, I spent 26 years being loud on purpose, giving orders, running formations, making sure 18-year-olds came home the same number as they left. In retirement, I wanted to be quiet on purpose. Nobody at the hardware store in Duluth knew I'd been awarded a Silver Star outside Kandahar in 2003. Nobody needed to. I liked being just Hal, the guy with the good dog and the radio hobby. There was a rhythm to that life that I'd come to depend on, the way you depend on a floorboard that always creaks in the same spot. Tuesdays I drove out to a scrapyard on Rice Lake Road that let me pick through old console televisions and dead stereo consoles for parts nobody else wanted anymore. Thursdays I had coffee with a neighbor named Owen Pratt, a retired railroad conductor 2 doors down, and we solved absolutely nothing about the state of the world from his front porch, which was exactly the point. Sunday evenings I called Megan, always around 7, because that was when Emma finished her bath and would take the phone for a few minutes to tell me, in exhaustive detail, about whatever she'd learned that week, how sharks don't have bones, how the moon was actually falling toward the earth all the time, but just kept missing. I mention all of this because I want you to understand the size of the world I was protecting. It wasn't a big world. It didn't need to impress anybody. After 26 years of deployments and promotions and the particular loneliness of command, I had traded ambition for something smaller and, to me, far more valuable, a life nobody was grading. Carol used to say I came back from every deployment a little more silent than I left, and that the silence never fully drained back out of me. She wasn't wrong. But she also used to say that my silence wasn't emptiness, it was just where I kept things. I believed her on that point more than I believed most things in my life, and I still do. My daughter, Megan, was 34 then, living in Minneapolis, 2.5 hours south, married to a man named Tyler Voss. Tyler was 36, and he had just opened his first restaurant that spring, a farm-to-table place in the North Loop called the Birchwood Room, the kind of restaurant where the menu describes the carrots by the name of the farm they came from. I was proud of him for that. Starting a restaurant is a hard, unglamorous, expensive way to bet on yourself, and I respected the nerve it took. My granddaughter, Emma, was 7, sharp as a tack, and the best part of any visit to Minneapolis by a wide margin. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I liked Tyler in the beginning. He was ambitious and he made my daughter laugh, and those two things covered a lot of ground with me. It took time and a slow accumulation of small moments before I understood what was underneath the charm. The first moment came at Easter, about a year and a half into their marriage. We were at Tyler's parents' place in Edina, a nice colonial with a lawn cut in stripes, and the conversation had drifted, as it does, to what everyone did for a living. Tyler's father was an orthopedic surgeon. His mother sat on some hospital foundation board. When it got around to me, I said I was retired Army. Retired from what, though? Tyler said, not unkindly, more like he was making a joke for the table. Like admin stuff? Logistics? Infantry mostly, I said. Some other things later. Right, he said, already looking past me toward the wine. My Uncle Rick was in the reserves for like 2 years. Never left Fort Bragg. I always figured most of it's like that. I let it go. It wasn't malicious, just careless, the kind of thing people say when they've never had to think hard about a subject. I changed it to a joke about Rosie stealing a whole rotisserie chicken off the counter that winter, and the table laughed, and Easter went on. The second moment came about 8 months later, at Thanksgiving, hosted that year at Megan and Tyler's condo. I'd brought a bottle of wine I'd actually put some thought into, a Oregon Pinot a fellow at the VFW had recommended, $42, which for me was a real splurge. Tyler took one look at the label and set it on the counter without opening it. We've actually got a really nice vertical going tonight, he said, gesturing at 3 bottles already breathing on the sideboard, each one probably running $120 or more. I'll save yours for, like, a weeknight thing. Small. I know it's small. But Megan caught my eye across the room, just for a second, and I saw her flinch on my behalf, which told me she'd clocked something I was trying not to. The third moment, 6 months after that, hurt more because it involved Emma. We were at a 4th of July barbecue at Tyler's sister's lake house. Emma had made a drawing at school, a soldier standing next to a flag, with my grandpa written across the top in her wobbly 7-year-old print. She'd brought it specially to give me. Tyler picked it up off the table where I'd set it, glanced at it, and laughed. She's been learning about Veterans Day at school. Real cute. Little morbid, though, don't you think? Kids drawing soldiers. He said it to his sister, not to me, like I wasn't standing 4 feet away. I keep telling Megan I don't love how much the war stuff gets romanticized for kids. I picked the drawing up off the table myself, folded it once, careful not to crease the crayon too hard, and put it in my shirt pocket. I didn't say anything. Emma looked confused, like she'd done something wrong, and that was the part that actually cost me something, watching a 7-year-old wonder if her gift had been a mistake. The fourth moment was the one that set the stage for everything else. It was late September, a soft opening dinner Tyler threw at the Birchwood Room for family, ahead of a bigger relaunch he had planned for October tied to a Veterans Day charity promotion, an irony that would only become clear to me later. There were maybe 30 people there. Tyler stood up with a glass of champagne to make a toast about the restaurant's mission, about real food, real craft, real people. And somewhere in the middle of it, he made a comment about how the dining room was for people who've actually built something, gesturing loosely around the room, skipping right over me and Rosie's old leash still looped over my wrist because I'd walked over from where I'd parked. Small moments. None of them, alone, would be worth telling you about. But 4 small moments, stacked one on top of the other over a year and a half, start to look like a shape. And I am a man who spent 26 years reading terrain. I could see the shape forming. I just didn't yet know what it would cost to finally step into it. I want to pause here and say something about why I didn't confront any of it earlier, because I know some of you watching are already frustrated with me for staying quiet as long as I did. It wasn't fear. At 67 years old, there is very little a 36-year-old restaurant owner can say to me that actually lands as a threat. It was something closer to a calculation I'd made a long time ago, back when I was a young sergeant learning how to hold a platoon together, that the men who escalate every slight into a battle usually win the battle and lose the war. Megan loved him. Emma adored him. Every time I felt the sting of one of Tyler's comments, I ran a kind of silent math. Was this the hill, or wasn't it? For a year and a half, it never quite was. I told myself I could absorb a little condescension if it meant Thanksgiving stayed peaceful, if it meant Emma got to grow up with both her parents laughing at the same table. I was wrong about one part of that math, though I wouldn't understand which part until later. I had assumed that staying quiet cost only me. It didn't. It was quietly costing my granddaughter something too, teaching her, one small unanswered insult at a time, that this was simply how her grandfather was meant to be treated. That, more than anything Tyler ever said about me directly, is what finally moved the needle. The catalyst came on the second Saturday of October at the relaunch dinner for the Birchwood Room's Veterans Day promotion, an event Tyler was hosting for donors, local press, and a handful of city council members, meant to announce a Heroes Table initiative offering discounted dinners to veterans throughout November. I'll tell you plainly, I thought that initiative, on its face, was a kind gesture, and I told Megan so when she invited me down for the preview dinner. I drove the 2.5 hours from Duluth with Rosie in the back seat, dropped her at Megan's condo with a sitter, and put on the one good sport coat I own. The dining room was full, 40, maybe 50 people, City Council member Dianose among them, along with a food writer from the Star Tribune and several members of the restaurant's investor group. Tyler had lined the walls with framed photographs of the farms his kitchen sourced from, and there was a small brass plaque already mounted by the entrance announcing the Heroes Table program, launching that November, offering veterans 40% off dinner service on Mondays and Tuesdays. I remember reading that plaque on my way in and feeling, genuinely, a small swell of pride in the son-in-law I had. There was a seating chart, printed and laminated, sitting on an easel near the host stand. Megan and Tyler were placed at the head table with the investors. I found my name near the bottom of the chart, at a small foretop near the kitchen doors, directly beside the coat check station, close enough that every server pushing through the swinging door brushed my chair on the way past. Emma sat beside me because she'd asked to, tugging her mother's sleeve until Megan agreed to let her switch seats. Partway through dinner, one of the investors, a man I didn't know, leaned toward Tyler and asked, loud enough to carry, whether any actual veterans would be attending the November promotion or if it was more of a marketing angle. Tyler laughed, the easy, practiced laugh he used with donors, and said, honestly, most of the actual guys who'd show up for a free meal deal aren't exactly, table 6 material. We'll comp them at the bar, keep the dining room for the people who are really here for the food program. Then, and this is the part one will not forget as long as I live, he glanced over at me and added, no offense, Hal. I don't mean you specifically. The room didn't go silent, not exactly, but I felt Emma go very still beside me. Grandpa, she said, quiet, just for me. Why doesn't Daddy think you deserve a seat at his table? I didn't have an answer for her. Not one I could give a 7-year-old, anyway. I told her the truth was complicated and that it wasn't her job to carry it, and I meant that. But something in me had gone very still too, the same stillness I remembered from 20 years earlier, the kind that comes right before you decide something and don't tell anyone yet that you've decided it. I finished my dinner. I thanked the servers by name, because I always do. I hugged Emma goodbye and told her the drawing she'd made me the summer before was still in my truck's glove box, which was true. I found Megan in the kitchen hallway afterward, and I told her I loved her, and that I was proud of her, and that I was tired, and that I was going to head back to the hotel. She searched my face for something, and I gave her nothing to find, not because I was hiding pain, but because I genuinely wasn't in pain the way people expect. I was in a different state entirely. Calculating. Tyler, for his part, spent the rest of that week doing what men like Tyler do when a small crack opens in their performance. He got loud about it in the wrong direction, not toward me, but toward Megan, according to what she told me later, snapping at her for making it weird when she gently suggested he call and apologize. He canceled a follow-up meeting with the food writer because he was convinced, wrongly, that she'd overheard the comment and would use it. He was reactive. He was defensive. He raised his voice at people who hadn't done anything to him. I did none of that. I drove home to Duluth. I took Rosie for our usual walk down to the point the next morning, same time as always. I sat at my workbench that evening with the Zenith radio, half restored, and let my hands do something patient while my mind did something else entirely. Here is the thing I want you to understand, because it's the whole hinge of this story. Restraint is not the same thing as swallowing it. People confuse those two constantly. Swallowing it means you absorb the insult and let it become a wound that festers quietly for years, resentment with nowhere to go. Restraint means you feel the full weight of what happened. You let it inform exactly what you do next, and then you act, deliberately, on your own timeline, with your own resources, toward an outcome that actually changes something. I had spent 26 years learning the difference between a soldier who panics under fire and a soldier who goes quiet and starts thinking. The quiet ones are the ones you want beside you. I've buried men who were loud in the wrong moments, and I've never once buried a man for being too quiet at the right one. That distinction mattered to me more that week than almost anything else. Tyler mistook my calm for something soft, the way people sometimes do, and I understood why. We live in a culture that equates volume with strength, that treats a raised voice as evidence of conviction and a level one as evidence of weakness. I don't believe that, and 26 years in uniform taught me not to. The men I served with who panicked, who shouted, who let their emotions run the operation, those were the men who got people hurt. The ones who went quiet, who slowed everything down and thought 3 steps ahead before they moved, those were the ones who brought their people home. I wasn't going to abandon that instinct at a dinner table just because the stakes had shrunk down to the size of a family instead of a platoon. If anything, I trusted it more because I'd tested it under conditions considerably worse than a bad toast at a restaurant relaunch. I went quiet. And then I went to a drawer in my study that I hadn't opened in 3 years. In that drawer was a green folder, the kind with an elastic band around it, holding paperwork I had never once mentioned to Tyler, and, if I'm honest, had barely mentioned to Megan either. Here's what most people in that dining room didn't know about me. After I retired from the Army in 2019, I didn't just restore radios and walk a dog. I spent 3 years sitting on the advisory board of a regional nonprofit called the Northland Valor Trust, an organization that provides small business loan guarantees to veteran entrepreneurs and, in a broader capacity, partners with a larger philanthropic fund, the Heritage Fund for Veteran Enterprise, that channels grant money and low-interest capital into community redevelopment projects with a veteran employment component. I don't say any of this to brag. I say it because it matters to what happened next. 3 years earlier, when Tyler was first trying to secure financing for the Birchwood Room and traditional banks balked at a first-time restaurateur with no collateral, Megan had come to me, quietly, and asked if I knew anyone who might help. I did. I made a call to a colleague on the Heritage Fund's loan committee, a woman named Patricia Alvarez, and I personally co-signed a $175,000 SBA-backed loan guarantee that got Tyler's restaurant off the ground. I asked Patricia and Megan to keep my name off any documents Tyler would routinely see because I didn't want him running his business feeling watched by his father-in-law, and because, and this is the part that stings a little to admit, I didn't want him to like me only because he owed me something. I wanted him to like me because I was worth liking. That request, in hindsight, is exactly what let 4 years of small disrespect accumulate without consequence. Nobody in that dining room knew that the man being told he wasn't table 6 material was the reason the table existed at all. There was a second piece of paper in that folder, too, dated that same October. The Heritage Fund had recently begun formal review of a proposed second-round grant, $240,000, that Tyler had applied for that summer to fund the Veterans Day Heroes Table expansion into a second location. The review committee for that specific grant cycle was chaired, as of 11 months earlier, by me. I hadn't recused myself because I hadn't known, when I accepted the chair position, that the applicant on file was my own son-in-law's restaurant. Grant applications don't cross my desk with a name attached until formal review, by design, to prevent exactly the kind of favoritism people might assume was happening here. When his file finally landed in front of me with his name on it, 3 weeks after that dinner, I sat with it a long time before I called Patricia. "Hal," Patricia said, when I explained the situation over the phone, "I need to be straight with you. You cannot chair this specific review. That's a conflict of interest, full stop, and it protects you as much as it protects him. But the application itself has to stand or fall on its own paperwork, separate from either of you. That was exactly right, and it was exactly what I wanted to hear. I have never had much use for institutions that bend their own rules for the people running them, and I wasn't about to let one bend for me. I recused myself formally, in writing, the same week, and asked Patricia to keep a copy of that recusal letter on permanent file, dated and notarized, so that no one, not Tyler, not Megan, not some future board member looking for a reason to question the trust's integrity, could ever credibly claim I'd had a thumb on the scale. Patricia assigned the file to a 3-person independent panel made up of people who had never met me or Tyler, a retired credit union manager, a small business professor from the University of Minnesota, and a veteran restaurateur from Rochester who'd been through the trust's process himself years earlier. I stayed away from every meeting. I didn't ask Patricia for updates. And this part surprised me a little, though maybe it shouldn't have. The panel flagged real financial irregularities in Tyler's application. Not fraud, nothing criminal, but the kind of shortcuts an inexperienced business owner makes. Revenue projections built on unrealistic occupancy numbers, a debt service schedule that didn't account for his existing loan guarantee, and a veteran employment commitment in the application that, on closer look, amounted to 2 part-time dishwashing positions. Around the same time, entirely independent of the trust, Megan discovered, because she did the restaurant's books on the side, that Tyler was 6 weeks behind on the existing $175,000 loan's quarterly servicing payment, the one I'd personally guaranteed. She called the bank's small business liaison, a loan officer named Marcus Webb, to understand their options, and it was Marcus who first told her, plainly and without ceremony, whose name was actually attached as guarantor. "Ma'am," he told her, "your father's signature is the entire reason this loan exists. Without that guarantee, your husband's restaurant doesn't open in 2023. It doesn't open at all." Megan called me that night, and I could hear in her voice that something in her understanding of the last 3 years had just been rearranged. Not a shouting match. Not a courtroom drama. Just a bank officer stating facts, and a grant committee reading numbers on a page, doing the quiet, unglamorous work that institutions are actually good at, establishing what's true without anybody needing to raise their voice. Tyler found out about the loan guarantee the same week the grant panel's preliminary rejection letter arrived. Megan told me later that he sat at their kitchen table with both documents in front of him for a long time before he said anything. He called me on a Tuesday night. I remember because Rosie was asleep against my foot and the radio on my bench finally, after 11 months, had a working shortwave band. "Hal," he said. His voice didn't have any of its usual polish in it. Megan showed me the loan paperwork. "All right," I said. "You've had your name on this restaurant since before it opened." A pause. "Since before you ever sat at that back table by the coat check." "I have." "Why didn't you say something?" "Any of the times He stopped himself. I let the silence sit, because I've learned that a man usually finishes his own sentence better than you can finish it for him. "Because," he said, quieter, "I've said some real garbage to you. About the army. About the table thing. In front of Emma." "You have?" I said. I wasn't going to soften that for him. There was a longer silence then, and when he spoke again it came out less like an excuse and more like something closer to an explanation, which I think is worth distinguishing. "My dad's a surgeon. Successful, by every measure anybody cares about. And growing up, the men who worked with their hands, in uniform, doing anything that wasn't a listed profession on a hospital fundraising gala program. That was the world he taught me to look down on, without ever saying so directly. I think I built this whole restaurant, this whole idea of who belongs at my table, out of trying to prove I wasn't that kind of ordinary. And you were the most ordinary-looking successful man I'd ever met, and it made me uncomfortable, and I took it out on you instead of figuring out what it actually meant. That's not an excuse. I know it's not. I wanted you to know where it came from. I appreciate you telling me that," I said. And I did. It didn't erase 4 years, but it gave me something to actually work with, which an excuse never does. 2 days later, the Heritage Fund's independent panel finalized its decision. The $240,000 grant was denied on the merits, with a formal invitation to reapply the following cycle with a revised, more honest business plan. No scandal, no headline, no public shaming. Just a letter, on file, stating the numbers as they actually were. Tyler asked me, humbly, if I would help him rebuild the application from scratch, this time with real veteran hiring commitments instead of 2 dishwashing shifts. I told him I'd help him find someone qualified to do that. Patricia, as it happened, offered a consulting session on the trust's dime, but that I would not personally be involved in reviewing or guaranteeing anything of his again until some time had passed and some trust had been rebuilt through ordinary, undramatic consistency. That was the boundary. I said it once, plainly, and I didn't repeat it, because repeating a boundary is usually a sign you don't trust yourself to hold it. Here's where that Saturday in the gravel lot comes in, the one I mentioned at the start. What Tyler didn't know, what nobody at the trust had told him, because it genuinely wasn't relevant to the grant review, was that the Piedmont Avenue VFW post back in Duluth had, independently of any of this, been planning a retirement honor ride for me for months. Every 5 years since I hung up my uniform, the post organizes a legacy ride, a convoy of veterans on motorcycles and in trucks, flags mounted, traveling from Duluth down through the region to a different honoree's town, ending with a small ceremony and a shared meal somewhere the honoree chooses. It's not a large production. 40, maybe 45 riders, mostly Vietnam and Gulf War vets in their 60s and 70s, plus a handful of younger post 9/11 veterans who'd come up through my mentorship program. When the post commander asked me, back in July, where I wanted the ride to end that year, I told him, without thinking too hard about it, that my daughter's restaurant in Minneapolis made a fine, personal choice. I'd been proud of that place once, and some part of me was still trying to be. Nobody had coordinated that date against Tyler's calendar. It landed, by pure accident, on the same Saturday as a scheduled visit from 2 members of the actual Heritage Fund Board, reviewing whether the Birchwood Room's revised veteran hiring plan, the honest one, the one built with Patricia's help, was worth a smaller, second-chance grant. So there I was, mid-October, standing in the gravel lot behind the restaurant with Rosie on a leash, having no earthly idea that 40 motorcycles were about 10 minutes out, when Tyler stepped outside to catch his breath before the board members arrived. I could hear the engines before either of us could see them, that low collective rumble building up the block, flags snapping, and then they came around the corner in formation, headlights on in the daylight the way we always ride it, out of respect for the ones who don't get to ride anymore. Tyler's face, when he understood what he was looking at, is something I'll remember for a long time. Not embarrassment, something more like recognition arriving all at once. 40 riders dismounting in an orderly line, veterans he'd have described, 3 weeks earlier, as not being Table 6 material, and every one of them there for me, specifically, unasked, because of 26 years of showing up for other people quietly enough that nobody outside that world had noticed. The 2 Heritage Fund board members pulled into the lot about 4 minutes later and found themselves walking straight into the middle of it. One of them, a woman named Ruth Okafor, recognized several of the riders from other veteran employment programs the fund had supported over the years. She didn't need anyone to stage anything for her. She just watched a restaurant owner standing frozen in a gravel lot, while 40 veterans greeted his father-in-law by rank and by name. And she drew her own conclusions about what kind of place actually understood the community it claimed to serve. Tyler did the one thing, in that moment, that told me the accountability from 2 weeks earlier had actually taken root. He didn't try to spin it. He walked straight up to the post commander, introduced himself, and asked, plainly, if the group would be willing to come inside and eat on the house while he and Ruth finished their meeting. Then he found me in the crowd, in front of everyone, and said, "Hal, would you sit at the head table with us? I'd consider it an honor." I said yes. Emma, who'd come along that day with Megan, ran straight into the middle of it all and asked, wide-eyed, if she could sit next to me and one of the riders, a Gulf War vet named Sergeant First Class Dolores Kim, who'd once served under me, said of course she could. That's what the table's for now. None of what I've told you resolved itself in one gravel lot afternoon, and I want to be honest with you about that, because tidy endings are for movies, not for families. Over the following months, Tyler and I built something slower and more ordinary than reconciliation usually looks like on television. In November, the Birchwood Room quietly ran its Heroes Table promotion, and this time it wasn't a marketing line. Tyler personally called the VFW post and asked for a list of veterans who might want a seat, and he seated them in the main dining room. No back tables, no comping them off to the bar. He hired 2 veterans that winter as full-time line cooks, not part-time dishwashers, and the following spring, with Patricia's guidance, his revised grant application was approved for $95,000, smaller than his original ask, honestly earned. He and I didn't become instant best friends. That's not how 2 very different men catching up on years of misrespect works. But every few weeks he'd call and ask my opinion about something in the business, not because he needed my money anymore, but because he'd started to actually want my judgment. In February, unprompted, he drove up to Duluth on a Sunday, sat in my garage while I worked on that Zenith radio, and just talked. About his father. About Megan. About the restaurant. He didn't apologize again. He'd already done that once, and done it honestly, and I've never believed in making a man repeat an apology like a punishment. Instead, he just showed up, consistently, which is worth more than any single speech. There were setbacks along the way, and I think it's worth telling you about at least one of them, because a story with no friction in its healing isn't an honest one. In March, at Emma's 8th birthday party, Tyler slipped back into an old habit for about 30 seconds, made an offhand joke to another parent about how I'd finally earned my keep at the restaurant, a comment that still carried a whiff of the old condescension underneath its friendlier wrapping. I didn't let it pass the way I once would have. I pulled him aside, quietly, away from the kids, and told him plainly that the joke landed wrong, that I understood he didn't mean it the way it sounded, but that I needed him to notice when the old pattern crept back in, because I wasn't going to spend the second half of my life pretending small things didn't matter just to keep a peace that wasn't real. He didn't get defensive. He apologized on the spot, and he actually thanked me for saying something instead of just filing it away. That, to me, was more encouraging than any single grand gesture could have been. Proof that the boundary I'd set once, cleanly, back in that phone call in October, had actually held. By summer, the Heroes Table program had become something the local paper wrote a small, unglamorous feature about. Not a puff piece, just an accurate accounting of a restaurant that had genuinely restructured its hiring and its seating around the community it served. Sergeant First Class Dolores Kim ended up picking up part-time hostess shifts there on weekends. Mostly, she told me, because she liked keeping an eye on things. Owen Pratt drove down from Duluth once that summer just to see the place for himself, and left, I'm told, a $20 tip on an $11 lunch, which is exactly the kind of thing Owen would do. The symbolic piece of all this, if you want one, is a small thing. That drawing Emma made me, the soldier next to the flag, my grandpa across the top, had gotten a little worn from riding folded in my shirt pocket that 4th of July. Tyler had it professionally framed that winter, without telling me, and hung it in the entryway of the Birchwood room, right where every guest walking in has to pass it. Not as a gesture for an audience, just because he wanted it there. Rosie's getting older now, grayer around the muzzle, still delighted by rotisserie chicken whenever she can get near one. The Zenith radio works fine these days, if you're patient with the dial. And there's a chair at the head table of my daughter's restaurant that nobody reserves for investors or donors anymore. It's just for family. All of it. If there's one thing I'd want you to carry out of this, it's this. The people who quietly absorb disrespect are very often the same people quietly holding up more of your world than you'll ever be told about. And the truth about a person rarely announces itself loudly. It just waits, patiently, for the moment someone finally asks the right question. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs the reminder. And if you've got a story of your own, about being underestimated by family, or about the slow, unglamorous work of earning your way back to someone's respect, I'd genuinely like to read it in the comments below.